Hello, welcome to episode -1 of Chaosmick Gnarl. I am Word Cowan, and today I will be reading to you an essay about the Word Cowan. It's a Freemasonic term in this context, not a surname, but this essay does talk about surnames and the etymology involved. This is a web page that was taken down several years ago. I think by 2012 it was taken down. This is a screen capture from 2009. And I first found it in 2012 or 2013 when I was researching the word Cowan. I had gone to Scotland, and while there, a librarian who had seen my ID told me that my last name derived from Colquhoun. She knew this because her husband's last name was also Cowan. And then so when I went back to the United States, I did some searching online and I found this essay, which mentions Colquhoun as part of the etymology. This is by Francine Bernier in 2008. The original essay is written in French. The first part I am using a auto-translate, and the second part she provided her own English translation. I will struggle with a lot of the words in here because they are French, Old English, Latin, Gaelic, and I haven't read a lot of them. This first part is actually entirely new to me because when I first found the essay, I had only found the second half. I'll include a link to this archive, to this Wayback Machine archive page in the description, so you can also read it yourself. All right. Introduction. For many people, and many Freemasons in particular, it is futile to try to understand the sociological origin of a symbol, since its primary meaning is considered a priori, immutable, timeless, and universal, and therefore its distortion is inconceivable. The active value of the symbol thus resides in each Freemason's ability to actualize it, to give it life, in such a way that it becomes coherent, even compatible with their own nature. Thus, for the moment of initiation, the apprentice enters a place outside of time and space where everything is a symbol. From then on, they are led to appropriate the meaning of the signs presented to them, making them the tools of their transformation, probing the intimate truths of their own nature without ever questioning that of the symbol. In the legal field, distortion falls under the sovereign power to interpret and modify the meaning of a law or a principle in order to make it compatible with the principles of a convention. It must be acknowledged that the spirit of the age sometimes prevails over tradition. The same was true in Freemasonry, also subject to the sovereign power of the lodge, and the meaning given to certain ancient words, deemed incoherent or incompatible with modernity, suffered a distortion brought about by customs and philosophies. Thus deprived of their original and fruitful essence, some signs and words from the Scottish Rite, such as the old term Cowan, ended up dying out in the chain of union that aspired to be increasingly universal. Francine Bernier, for the Provincial Friends of Traditional Renaissance, APRT, Montreal, February 13th, 2008. Part 1. Burgess and Paganus. Quote, "It is not vows that create traditions, but attachment to practices." Jules Jacques. The origin and meaning of this word have been the subject of much debate, but all historians, whether Freemasons or not, have agreed that it is specific to Freemasonry and used only in Scotland, and has been since at least the 16th century. What is known, however, is that this term, which fell into disuse more than 100 years ago, initially referred to a mason who built dry stone walls without joints or mortar, then to one who had not completed an apprenticeship according to established rules, and finally to one who had not received the word Mason. The debate on the meaning and origin of this word was revived in the first issue of the journal Renaissance Traditionnelle, published in January 1970. The founder and editor of the journal, René Gully Desaguliers, published an article entitled Notes on the Masonic Oath of the First Degree, in which he wrote that, quote, the Mason without the word was only a Cowan, end quote, specifying in a footnote that, quote, the best translation into French of this difficult word seems to us to be maneuver. In the following issue, April 1970, pages 165 through 7, Brother Jonas Corneloup, 1888 to 1978, author of numerous essays published in the Bulletin of the Grand College of Rights, of which he was Grand Commander for life, replied that it, quote, would be a grave error, end quote, to translate the word Cowan as, quote, maneuverer, for the major reason that the word Cowan was an essentially pejorative meaning, whereas the word maneuverer in no way prejudges either the moral worth of the worker or the good or bad execution of the work entrusted to him. The word Cowan, as used in Freemasonry, does indeed have a pejorative connotation, but this does not mean that it has always been so. In fact, Corneloup himself laid the foundation for the problem, but without exploring it in depth. Quote, semantics takes into account analogies, associations of ideas that can arise from certain similarities of sounds, end quote. Thus he wondered, isn't it remarkable that the pronunciation of the French word cune, a pejorative term in the journeyman system, is very close, if not identical, to that of the English word Cowan. From this, Corneloup went on to propose a possible importation into Scotland by former archers, the word Cuin, whose spelling would have been quite naturally become Cowan to conform to Anglo-Saxon phonetics. A matter of convention and propriety. Although logical, Corneloup's hypothesis nevertheless overlooks a sociological reality at the very heart of the semantic problem, the phenomenon of adaptation through consonants, by which the initial meaning of the foreign word, in context to acculturation, can be lost, modified, or even distorted. It is surprising to say the least that a historian of Corneloup's caliber should have remained silent about the existence of the English word coven, phonetically identical to Cowan. Indeed, this word appears in England in a 1360 amendment of the Statute of Labourers of 1351. This new provision abolished all coven, that is, annual assemblies, the equivalent of convents today, and by extension oaths and secretive agreements binding masons or carpenters. This word, which some believe to be of French origin, from covine, actually comes from the Latin convenire, to agree, to accept, which also gave us convention and convent. But this abrupt prohibition was enough to give the term coven the negative connotation of scheme, deception, sham work, or fraud, because such an agreement, good or bad, was made sub rosa. Moreover, the word coven still survives today in English legal jargon to designate a fraudulent contract. However, it is essential to consider the context surrounding the use of the word in England. The Great Plague, 1348-50, having claimed many victims among skilled workers, two laws, the Ordinance of Laborers of 1349 and the Statutes of Labor 1351, had forbidden peasants from leaving their villages while imposing a wage freeze. Faced with critical need for workers, some London employers did not hesitate to defy the law by offering generous wages to peasants who, needing to ensure their own survival, would agree as freemen to come and practice their trade as masons or carpenters in the capital. Although the employer was the instigator of the offense, only the peasant who agreed to disobey the law was threatened with imprisonment. It is therefore understandable that he had to keep such a coven secret. in collusion with the employer, and this is precisely what the 1360 Amendment aimed to prohibit. As for the employer not being specifically targeted by this amendment, he had nothing to fear, especially since the decision to hire anyone belonged to him. It should be noted that until 1351, all English masons, regardless of rank, were called caementari, meaning that they used cement or mortar and therefore all earned the same wage. But the Statute of Laborers of 1351 changed this, henceforth recognizing two classes of masons: the master freestone mason, the highest paid of all craftsmen, and the other, who was henceforth considered equal to the master carpenter and the tiler, all receiving the same lower wage. As we have explained, the term coven, used in 1360 amendment, referred to secret conventions and assemblies, primarily those involving masons or carpenters. This amendment was undoubtedly demanded by the London companies, which had no power to prevent the fraudulent hiring, covenus, of lower-class foreign craftsmen at higher wages than their own. However, the amendment applied to all masons and carpenters, regardless of their origin. We can therefore assume that the implicit notion of presumed fraud associated with any coven was aimed first and foremost at masons and carpenters who, unable to provide for themselves in their villages, came to work illegally in a large city, at the risk of their own freedom. This does not mean, however, that these peasants were incompetent, inferior, or eavesdroppers. We might be tempted to conclude that Cowan was a Scotch Gaelic adaptation of the English word coven, as George Canning believed, since the use of Cowan is only attested in 1598 in the first statutes of Shaw, and it was used in England as early as 1738 in the second version of Anderson's constitutions. But this still does not mean that there were no Cowans in Scotland with a different meaning before 1360. The historical context surrounding the introduction of the term coven in England allows us at least to understand how a war of rights and privileges could have begun between two classes of workers, one urban, the other peasant. On one side, the proud guardian of a fortress, burgess, of advanced knowledge, the honest, regulated, and reliable mason, raised to the status of master by education, better paid than the others, and the only one worthy of working for the progress of the city. On the other hand, there was the pagan, paganus, primitive and self-taught, from the wild land, without moral elevation, capable of lying or stealing, illiterate, ignorant and inferior because his tradition was oral and his technique rudimentary. In short, the learned elite versus the common people, or rather, the poen, a term phonetically identical to Cowan, commonly used in London during the 17th century, particularly within the woodworking guilds, to designate the common man. At this stage, nothing allows us to determine which of the three countries, France, Scotland, or England, borrowed from the other's language, but given the historical Franco-Scottish ties, it is almost certain that the word Cowan resulted from a transfer through sound from one language or culture to another. However, it is far from established that Cowan is a phonetic adaptation of the word couen or French, or another French word such as couvin or coven in English, or even the Greek word koan, dog, all of which have negative connotations. Kuan, dog. A Scottish export to France is just a possible and even probable, since the word Cowan, in this spelling at least, was only used in Scotland until the 18th century. And to reiterate Corneloupe's argument, thousands of Scottish archers came to France during the first half of the 15th century, and subsequently many of them were recruited to form the elite guard of the King of France, based at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, until 1560, the year in which Scotland, having become Protestant, withdrew from the Old Alliance in Scot Gaelic, or rather Gaelic, by the Treaty of Edinburgh. The French and Scots had benefited from dual citizenship, which incurred numerous borrowings from both cultures, particularly in language. In other words, the word Couen, for example, could have resulted from the Frenchification of the word Cowan, and the later could simply be the anglicized form of an older non-pejorative Gaelic word that was brought to France by Scottish archers. Insular particularism. In a letter published in issue 5 of Renaissance Traditionnelle, which appeared in January 1971, Roger du Mesnil-Ralt reported some significant points in response to Cornloop's commentary, based on a 1707 minute from the Kilwinning Lodge, which defined a Cowan as a Mason without the word. In other words, a layman. Mesnil-Ralt emphasizes the possibility of a Gaelic origin, stemming from the region of Kilwinning Abbey and its mother lodge. Quote, Kilwinning Abbey is located in the north of Country Ayr, 5 kilometers northwest of Irvine. In the beginning of the 18th century, it was situated in a region where only the Angle dialect was spoken, which had also made numerous borrowings from Gaelic. But it was close to regions where Gaelic was then spoken. Carrick, the southern third of County Ayr, and Galloway, counties Kirkcudbright and Wigtown to the south, the Glenkiln Mountains to the southeast, the Highlands to the north, and the islands to the west. End quote. Mesnil-Ralt becomes more precise. He emphasizes the existence of the old Gaelic word cumhan, phonetically identical to the word Cowan, as well as the variant cumhang. In Irish Gaelic, a coon or co, in Manx dialect, all he says meaning straight, narrow, constricted, contracted. Quote, of all of the forms of Celtic language, only the Scottish Gaelic form cumhan can be phonetically transcribed as Cowan, according to English spelling. Of all the meanings taken by this root in the various Neo-Celtic languages, both Gaelic and Brittonic, only Scottish Gaelic has the narrow-minded value that corresponds well to our conception of the layperson. Thus, phonetics and semantics seem to strongly support the Scottish and Gaelic origin of the word, attested since 1707. Mesnil-Ralt rightly notes the notion of narrow-mindedness associated with Cowan in Freemasonry, but he overlooks the primary non-figurative meaning attributed to cumhan, straight, narrow, and contracted passage. One of those derivates is cumhant, meaning contract, agreement, that is, quote, an agreement between two or more persons, an agreement by which parties commit themselves undertake to respect certain things, or agreement of wills between two or more natural or legal persons by which they undertake to do or not do something, end quote. This corresponds to the definition given to the English word coven in 1360, amendment to the Statute of Labourers, which cannot be a mere coincidence. However, since the notion of fraud or a secret agreement associated with the term coven and Cowan is the same, it is likely that it stems from a confusion between two similar Irish or Gaelic words. Indeed, one cannot ignore the close variation between cumhan and cubhan in Irish, meaning hollow cave, cumhnat, a Gaelic word meaning convention, contract, and agreement, which the English translated is covenant or cumha, which both mean mourning and condition, gift, bribe, signifying corruption. In English, several of these variants have been translated as hollow, a term that has always carried the second pejorative meaning of empty or hollow words, of a false promise. Isn't this similar in the biased interpretation that has been given to the words conven or Cowan, even though the original meaning referred only to a contract or agreement without any pejorative connotations? Mesnil-Ralt had consulted McAlpine's Pronunciation Gaelic Dictionary from 1942, one of the several authoritative works on the subject. But Colin Mark's New Scots Gaelic Dictionary from 2003 clarifies the vernacular use of the word cumhang, which comes from the same Irish root as cumhan, in addition to the meaning straight, narrow, to choke, as reported by MacBain in 1982 and McFarlane in 1912. The adjectival form is synonymous with insular, illiberal, ideas. While the noun designation, a passage, a narrow gorge, there is no derived verb. In other words, the Cumhang is the insular person who, being cut off from the world, far removed from modernity or major centers, is distinguished by their conservative ideas and traditional values. In English, Cumhang translates as defile, gorge, or narrow passage. However, in English, defile is also a verb meaning to corrupt, defile soil, to soil, tarnish reputation, rape, or debauchery, a meaning that doesn't exist in Gaelic. It's therefore possible that of all the Gaelic variants identified, Cumhang is the original source of the word Cowan, but that its meaning was negatively distorted by anglicization in large cities. The original Cowan was probably an island mason, a freeman working without mortar for practical reasons, whose tradition was oral and passed down from father to son. We take as evidence the fact that in 1790, while the word Cowan prejudged the moral worth of the worker of the lodges of Edinburgh and London, it was still used without any pejorative connotation in the islands and coastal regions of Argyll, north of Ayrshire, West Scotland, to designate the builder of stone without mortar. Quote, this pagan peasant mason who lived far from the major centers was not considered inferior or incompetent any more than his colleagues, the boat carpenter or the joiner. Moreover, all three received the same wage, and this equivalence between woodworking and stonework was culturally logical, as we shall see later. It is worth noting that, contrary to Mesnil-Ralt's assertion, the word Cowan is attested not from 1707, but from 1598. Indeed, William Shaw's earliest statutes specifically mention the prohibition against hiring Cowanese. In fact, this prohibition is easily comparable to that promulgated 2 centuries earlier in the Statute of Laborers. Furthermore, the fact that the criteria for Cowan status are not specified therein suggests that this designation was already in common use in 1598 within Scottish lodges. However, a first clarification appears in 1705 in a minute of the Kilwig Lodge, which describes a Cowan as a worker who has not received the mason's word. But it was only in 1707, the very year the Act of Union between Scotland and England was ratified, that this lodge followed suit. No mason shall employ no Cowan, which is to say, a mason without the word to work. The fact that the supposed cradle of Freemasonry took more than a century to comply with the prohibition promulgated by Shaw in 1598 is undoubtedly linked to the controversy surrounding the primacy granted to Mary's Chapel Lodge No. 1 in Edinburgh under Shaw's second statute of 1599. But this also posits the Kilwinning Lodge could be in a spirit of moral and territorial sovereignty, have employed Cowans until 1707. It was in 1600 that the first operative Scottish Masons compiled the Shaw's prohibition, but they were not necessarily a member of a lodge. Thus, the incorporations of Masons of Glasgow, which functioned like a lodge, adopted this resolution in 1600. Since its founding, which traces back to 1057, no manuscript evidence exists, this corporation had united the masons, carpenters, and coopers of Glasgow. In 1569, the coopers separated to form their own guild, and in 1600, the other 2 trades also separated. According to David Stevenson, the final separation would have considered the link between the corporation, now solely Masonic, and the Glasgow Lodge. But it would be logical to think that the acceptance of the Masons of the corporation into the lodge could not have been granted without their formal adherence to the prohibition against hiring Cowanese, promulgated by Shaw. It was also during the 17th century that Gaelic became the minority language in Scotland, a decline that became practically irreversible 100 years later, when English became the language of the free trade, progress, and modernity amongst the intelligentsia of the capital. Quote, Gaelic was the first language of use for half the Scots during the 15th century. for a third in 1689, and then for only a fifth in 1806. Linguistic diversity did not stop there, as the whole of Scotland was becoming anglicized. For its part, Scots Gaelic evolved into a literary medium during 14th to 16th century, approximately 1480 to 1520. But this declined sharply when the Scots used at court, considered the standard, fragmented into the regional dialects after the departure of James VI in 1603. The Anglicization of the language and culture continued throughout the 18th century. Edinburgh intellectuals of the Enlightenment preferred pronunciation spelling in line with the London's best practices, as it was English, at the expense of Scots Gaelic. But that became the language of the landed aristocracy, professional circles, and businesses. The Memory of Stone. In her article on the Word Cowan, reproduced in January 1972 in the journal Renaissance Traditionnelle, Amy Bothwell-Gosse, a member of Le Droit Humain and editor of the journals Co-Mason and Speculative Mason, explained that a Cowan was a freeman or journeyman, that is, an itinerant and contract worker, who could only exercise his right to work in the region under the jurisdiction of the lodge where he had been received. Indeed, even if the Cowan had not been properly instructed, he could become a free journeyman by either apprentice to a master Cowan, then be admitted to work as a Cowan. Admitted as a Cowaner. Cowaner received into the lodge, or even received a Cowan in the usual forms. 1661. As stipulated in the minutes of Canongate Kilwinnig Lodge in Edinburgh. In other words, a Cowan could be admitted to a Mason's lodge if he agreed, probably under oath, to abide by the established convention. This brings us back not only to the original meaning of contracted, attributed to the word Cowan, but also to the term conven, used in English in the Statute of Laborers. All this suggests that the Cowan was not as negligent and inferior a worker as one might think, but a Mason who, under certain conditions, could be accepted into a lodge. We have seen how in England the word conven could, from the outset, carry a widespread prejudice, then evolve into a legal term synonymous with a fraudulent agreement, and even a swindle. But how did the stonemason, working without mortar, come to have a reputation of an eavesdropper, or an intruder among his fellow townspeople? We are tempted to see in the same dog and wolf quarrel, which in England had deeply divided the rural and urban workers, two working classes with different customs and traditions. To understand this separation, we must go back in time and space to its source, Cumhang. In terms of space, we already know that we must focus our attention on the islands and coastal regions of western Scotland, where in 1791 the Cowan was still considered simply a stonemason without mortar. In terms of time, we believe we must go back to the end of the 11th century, when Malcolm III, Malcolm MacDonagh Credda, King of Scotland, married to devoutly Catholic Margaret, sister of Edgar Atheling, King of England. It was Malcolm who, under his wife's influence, imposed English at court. He is also credited with creating the Guild, or Corporation of Masons, Carpenters, and Coopers, in Glasgow in 1057. As for his wife, who may be beatified, it was she who from 1069 onwards undertook to Romanize Scotland with an uncommon zeal, worthy of the first Crusades. To carry out her project, she first had to put an end to the power and independence of the Chaldean canons, whose main seat was on the island of Iona, which is separated from the large island of Mull only by a narrow channel of 1 mile, and whom she considered to be bad Christians, barbarians, and heretics, because they dared to present the Eucharist without grandeur or decorum, in vulgar cups, or simple wooden altars gathered in small chapels made of tree trunks. In a century where the glorification of God was measured by the elevation of the works of Romanesque architecture, the Chaldeans appeared as ignorant people with archaic methods. Yet these men, whom the Scots considered the apostles of early Christianity, came from the same Irish tradition as their predecessors, Patrick of the 15th century, Cumba of Iona 16th century, and Breton Fillan of Ninian 14th century. The instigator of Christianity in Scotland, who, with masons from Tours, France, built the first stone church according to the Roman way, at Whithorn, Candida Casa White House in Galloway, on the west coast of Scotland. Although the Chaldeans who arrived from Ireland during the 9th century are now extinct, the negative perception that led to their demise persists to this day. Several historians and Freemasons, including Jacques Brenégout and Paul Naudon, have claimed that the Chaldeans only mastered woodworking, that their technique reflected an incompatible science, and that they expressed a resistance through wood to imported stone considered Roman or Gallic. And this disdain for stone perhaps had no other cause than their incompetence. However, according to several historians, including Mackay, Encyclopedia 1946, Lenning, Encyclopedia der Freemasonry 1828, Gaedic Primer Lexicon 1831, the Chaldeans established lodges and guilds of masons and practiced the art of sacred architecture in many places in Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and elsewhere in northern Europe. According to Gaedic, they may have even inspired the constitutions of York, which originated from the legendary Coven of 926, demanded by King Aethelstan, Noblestone. What is known for certain is that the monks of the Irish tradition of St. Columba of Iona typically built churches of wood, often oak, until the 12th century. They were excellent carpenters, and this tradition undoubtedly originated at the famous college and monastery of Chaosmick Gnarl in Ireland, founded in the 6th century by St. Ciaran, the first Mac Nsar, or Mac Nsor, meaning son of the free carpenter or artisan. It was from this Irish monastery that the Chaldeans who arrived in Scotland during the 9th century came. It was also these Irish monks who, between the 5th and 8th centuries, built many stone houses, without mortar, whose ruins can still be seen in St. Kilda, Inverness, and in the Hebrides and on the nearby coast of Argyll. In Ireland, in certain areas on the west coast, and in the islands where wood was scarce, the same monks built many stone buildings and churches. They had even developed several construction methods considered unique and even innovative. One of these resulted in a dome, a beehive cell. This is a round structure erected without mortar, in which successive rows of stone gradually overlapped towards the center as the walls rose, forming a dome that was then closed with a single stone. The Inuit used the same technique to build their igloos with blocks of hardened snow. Equipped with one or more windows, these beehives served as both shrines and shelters. A striking example of this technique, though slightly different in its oblong base measuring 22 feet by 18.5 feet, is the Gallerist Shrine in County Kerry. It was the stage of a pointed arch, both inside and out, thanks to the walls which gradually curved to meet at the top. Although the Irish excelled in mortarless construction, they eventually discovered and used this mixture to build small rectangular stone chapels with thinner vertical walls, whose stones were remarkably well squared. Their roofs were usually made of wood, thatched, but sometimes also of stone, as was the case with the old oratory of St. Flannan at Killaloe, near Limerick. In contrast, their Chaldean successors, originally from Clonmacnoise, left numerous traces in Scotland and Ireland that demonstrate a distinctive and innovative masonry technique, as well as a certain refinement in stonework. It was they who built the large round bell towers, Clochtiach, at Egilshay, Orkney, Brecon, and Abernethy, the only three still standing in Scotland today. At Iona, the two large stone crosses made from a single block, 12 to 14 feet high, planted in a red granite pedestal and sculpted with refined ornaments, are the only two that remained of the 360 stone crosses that once existed on the island. These works bear witness to a purely Irish tradition, but also to a science whose origin and secrets have yet to be fully discovered. To quote Montabert, one wonders how, with the means in use at such a remote period, it was possible to square, sculpt, transport, and erect blocks of granite of such size. In Ireland, one finds the same large round towers, up to 130 feet, with buttresses and hanses, always on former Columban monastic sites, just as in Scotland. For example, the tower of the monastery on the island of Tory, and another at Sword, now Swords, at Monty Boyce, 6th century, in the Boyne Valley, a formidable tower of 110 feet, as well as several stone crosses, one which is 27 feet, the 70-foot round tower at the monastery of Kells, which became a refuge to the monks of Iona, threatened in 807 by the Vikings, and the great tower of Glendalough, the two towers of Clonmacnoise. All these round towers were built in Scotland and Ireland during or following the Scandinavian invasions in the 8th or 9th century, and others later. Always erected near a church but separate from it, they often served as bell towers, but their primary purpose was the protection of the community. Their round shape made them completely impregnable. Colonel Montmorency, who had studied these structures, confirmed that the Chaldeans had demonstrated technical innovation in military architecture. Quote, considering the period during which it was designed, the pillar tower, as a defensive structure, it can be considered one of the most sophisticated inventions imaginable. Impregnable in every way, it could never fall into the hands of the attacker. Even if the abbey and its dependencies burned, the tower remained untouched by the flames. Its extraordinary heights, its isolated position from other buildings, and its narrow doorway, located dozens of feet above the ground, rendered it completely inaccessible to the invader. Another ingenious invention of Irish architects was the double roof technique as used in Killaloe Chapel, Columba's House of Kells, and Cormac's Chapel at Cashel. Once the walls were erected, a timber framework was built to form a vault, and then a second stone vault was constructed resting on the framework. Liquid mortar was poured into the joints between the stones, and once the mortar was thoroughly dry, the timber framework was removed. This resulted in a first stone roof, flat on top and vaulted inwards, upon which the second roof was built, allowing it to reach a much greater height without placing its entire weight on the side walls. All these remains and places of remembrance bear witness to an original art and a tradition far more developed than Brengu and Naudon claimed. There is no doubt that the technique of these audacious, inventive islanders was far from reflecting an incomplete science or a contempt for stone. They mastered wood and stone, the axe, hammer, and chisel. They knew how to build arches and domes, and how to work stone with or without mortar. And they used the most appropriate technique depending on the shape of the structure and the resources available in the surrounding environment. It is safe to assume that the Cowan of Argyll and Ayrshire embodied this tradition, and that he was only narrow-minded in the eyes of the proponents of modernity. My friend Joel Jacques is right. Quote, it is not vowels that create traditions, but attachment to practices. End quote. We still need to better understand the original nature of the Cowan, who remained attached to an ancestral tradition, this dry stain dyker of the islands, who in the past built walls and perhaps also dikes and canals, dig in Gaelic. In part 2 of our study, Libertas and Libertinus, we will set out in search of him, on the west coast of Scotland, and in the Hebrides, where 61% of the local population still spoke Gaelic in 2001. And that concludes part 1. Please excuse my inability to really wrap my mouth around some of these words. I'm not sure how to say a lot of Gaelic words. I'm not sure how to say a lot of French words. I did my best, though. I'm going to pause right here, and then I'll do part 2 after I have some lunch. All right, see you on the other side. Hello. I am back again. And levels are looking good. Clicking in. All right. We're going to put this down here. And then we're going to bring up our page. Okay. Welcome back to episode -1 of Chaosmick Gnarl. I am Word Cowan, and we are going over a essay titled The Word Cowan, and it's broken into 2 parts. This is part 2. The first part was in French and translated into English by a web translator. The second part was translated into English by the author. And when I first found this essay, it was only in part. It was an excerpt from the second part reposted on Above Top Secret, which was a message board I didn't really use much. I know a lot of people didn't really trust it. It was kind of considered disinfo. And the thread that this was pasted on was full of a lot of things that were kind of very off topic and disinfo-y. But in it, they pasted part of this essay, and that's how I found it initially. But it was already offline when they posted this thread. The blog that it was posted on was already taken offline. And I believe that was sometime in 2012, 2013. So I'm using the Wayback Machine to find a snapshot of it from 2009. And there's going to be a lot of Gaelic words, French, Old English, Latin, that I'm going to struggle to pronounce. A lot of the words are just like a letter different from each other, and I don't know how to say them either way, so I'm going to be making a lot of sounds that are probably not going to be easy to follow, even for myself. Because what this part of the essay really gets into is trying to trace the etymology of not just the word Cowan, but also the surnames which are related to it, such as Colquhoun. All right, and to begin, Part 2, Libertas and Libertinus. Quote, words are corrupted not by lengthening, but by abbreviating them. The uneducated and the careless are always prone to cut off a syllable, not to add a new one. Albert G. Mackey. Most historians who have tried to pinpoint the origin of the word Cowan have addressed the issue from a perspective limited to a purported transition period during the 17th century, before the birth of modern Freemasonry. Yet how come no one ever insisted on the fact that Cowan and Caerwan were both used indifferently in Scotland to designate the dry stane diker, the mason who built dry walls, i.e. without mortar, or the fact that the word Cowan was used as far back as the 1st century by the Celts of Caledonia, as well as their Belgian and Gaulish cousins. Several authors have tried to link the word to various linguistic roots, such as Greek, kuon, dog, or kohanim, Hebrew for priest. One of them was historian George Oliver, 1782 to 1867, a Freemason who believed the original word was Cohen, meaning devoted or servant of God, the name of the Jewish priest. Quote, "From the affair of Jephthah, an Ephraimite was termed a Cowan or worthless fellow. In Egypt, Cohen was the title of a prince or priest and a term of honor. Bryant, speaking of the Harpies, says they were priests of the sun, and as Cohen was the name of a dog as well as a priest, they are termed by Apollonius the dogs of Jove. Now St. John cautions the Christian brethren that without are dogs, cooves, cowans, or listeners, and St. Paul exhorts the Christians to beware of dogs because they are evil workers. Now, Kuan, a dog or evil worker, is the Masonic Cowan. The above priests or metaphorical dogs were also called Circeonians or Sir Cowans because they were lawless in their behavior towards strangers." End quote. Nowhere in the Bible are the Ephraimites called Cowans or Kuans. However, in 2 Chronicles 30 and 34, they are described as an unclean, idolatrous, and irreligious people who rebelled against God and opposed King Josiah's reforms, prohibition of idols, divinatory sciences, pagan and foreign deities. It is likely that Oliver based his argument on the circular throughout the two hemispheres, published in 1802 by the First Supreme Council, 33rd degree, ancient and accepted Scottish rite, that met in Charleston, South Carolina. Quote, "We read in the Book of Judges that the transposition of a single point over the sheen, in consequence of a national defect among the Ephraimites, designated the Cowans, and led to slaughter of 42,000. End quote. It is obvious that the word Cowan was used here in a metaphorical sense, in reference to the uninitiated, i.e., one who does not know the password or its correct pronunciation, as was the case of the Ephraimites. Yet we can understand how Oliver came to such a conclusion. Over 2 centuries, many Jews adapted their names to various European languages. For instance, in Ireland and Scotland, Cohen became Cohan. The opposite trend was observed in Scotland, where Scottish families changed their name from Cowan to Cohen, Cohen to Kuan. But in all cases, it did not mean these people were Jewish or that they held a priestly function. The frightening Cowan. In 82 AD, when Roman general Agricola attempted to annex Caledonia, Scotland, to the imperial province of Britannia, he was greeted in Dunbartonshire by, quote, barbarians, Adacotis, who occupied a large territory stretching from Loch Fyne west to Loch Lomond east. These fearless warriors were driving curum falcati chariots, armed with dangerous bronze scythes attached to the wheel hubs. According to Tacitus and other Latin chroniclers, the Celts called this type of chariot Cowain or Cowain, a purely Celtic word the Romans have translated to Covenus. In his Britannia, 1607, William Camden, who mastered Latin but not Celtic idioms, explained the meaning and usage of the word Cowain back in the early Christian times. Quote, "Another kind of wagon, a chariot, there was, which by one name the Romans called Covenus, and the driver Covenarius. And albeit this word together with that kind of wagon itself be quite grown out of use, yet the primitive thereof, as I may so say, remaineth still among the Britons, in whose language the word Cowain signifieth to carry or ride in a wagon." End quote. The Celtic origin of the word Cowan, Latinized as Covenus, was confirmed subsequently in several reference works, including Raget de Bellocquet's and Theogenie Gallois, quote, 1872. Quote, Covenus chariot, equipped with scythes used by Bretons and Belgians, from Cymric, cough, hollow trunk, Kaiwain and Cowain, to cart long, particularly cereal crops, says Gibson. Gawain, Gallic, transport cart, pot-bellied. And in a different train of thoughts, guanus, impairing, appalling, Irish cobhan, generative cobhain, coffer, trunk, or chest. In Old French, we had coffin, a round basket. In Irish, we would also have caum, running together, and cob, victory. We have already said that MH and BH are pronounced V, Covenarius, Tacitus, Agricola 35, the driver of these chariots, end quote. Several of these meanings agree with those given to the words comhang and cobhan by Celtologists MacBain and McFarlane, who translated them as hollow, coffer, box, or basket. MacBain adds that the notion of a box or basket, cobhan in Irish, comes from the chariot's main body, also called a basket, which was made of straw. We may also note the associated words cove, belly, and guain, cart, and guanus, appalling. But as observed French linguist Henry d'Arbois de Jubeneville, the English, who did not speak the Celtic languages, thought Cowain meant cow, from cow, cowin in plural form, plus wain, chariot. In other words, a cow chariot. On the other hand, the English verb to cow is to frighten into cowardice, to cause to cower or bend down, a description that would fit the frightening spinning scythes of the Cowain. We know that Covenus, chariot, and Covenarius, driver, were derived from the Celtic word Cowain, but how did the Celts call the chariot maker? In Latin, he was called a carpentarius, but in Gaelic, says Charles Valency, he was called a colmare, which is close to Scottish Gaelic comhan, narrow, and phonetically similar to Cowan, since MH was pronounced V. In Irish, according to Neil MacAlpine, the chariot maker was a Saur Coldleen, but in Scotland, according to James Grant and Alexander McBain, he was just a Saur, from Seoi, wisdom, knowledge, from which comes Sathair, one that pierces, penetrates, and Sathfur, free from all fear. In other words, the Saur of Scotland was a fearless craftsman, a learned wise man who could pierce all things, but also one who could do or make frightening piercing objects, such as the Cowain with bronze scythes. We could therefore believe the word Cowan, by some risky analogy, was eventually associated by the Anglo-Saxons with a person who was either fearless and frightening, or capable of making frightening, deceitful things, such as covens, i.e., secret agreements designed to cheat or defraud. What about Curwan? In Scotland, the word designated the dry stonemason and was pronounced Cowan. Yet the link is not strictly phonetic. Curwan and the related Gaelic words Caerwain, Caerwan, and Curvan are not only very close to Caiwain and Cowain, to carry and chariot, but all are derived from Sieran, meaning black, a significant color in olden times, as it was directly associated with the Gaban, from Gov, dew, and Gabha, dew, literally black craftsman. The Irish blacksmith, who, according to the books of Lacan and Ballymote, was from the great black race. And what link, if any, could there be between the words Cowan and Goban? Was the former a local adaptation of the latter? This seems to be the case. The name of the trade. In Scotland, a Gaelic surname usually reveals the geographic origins and clan lineage of a family, and is often derived from the trade of a key clan hero or ancestor. From the 15th to 17th century, particularly after the Scottish Reformation, 1560, a surname deemed too Gaelic could be viewed as a sign of peasantry, Catholic resistance, conspiracy, or religious nonconformism. In some cases, a name derived from an old trade was even associated with unsound practices, including magic and necromancy. For instance, on July 10, 1612, several families of Clan MacGregor were allowed by the Privy Council to change their name to Sinclair. Similarly, the MacNocairds, or Cairds, and Seards, from Mac na Searda, son of the smith, more specifically a Caird who worked in brass, became Sinclairs because their surname was often mistaken for tinker, also tinkler, a term that had become derogatory to label all vagrants and rovers since the arrival of the Roms in the early 1500s. These nomads, who claimed to be Egyptians, whence gypsies, were originally from Eastern Europe and had been the object of numerous ordinances until they were ordered to leave to Scotland in 1603 under threat of execution. However, as explained by ethnologist David MacRitchie, Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, the word tinker, which first appeared in this anglicized form in 1252, was the name of the traveling tinsieard, from tien, fire, and seard, craftsman or smith, from the Highlands. The first tinkers appeared under this anglicized form in Perth in the second half of the 13th century, then further south in Loch Maben in the 14th century. It is believed these traveling metal workers descended from the ancient Gauls of Ireland and arrived in Scotland before the 12th century. In the Orkneys, Argyll, and Lothians and Western Highlands, they were still known as Siar Danan, meaning black tinkers, sometimes summer walkers, until recently. As can be observed, these traveling metal workers who spoke Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, became more anglicized as their trade took them south, near the English borders. The black tinkers of the Highlands and the Orkney Islands also spoke a secret language of Irish origin called Shelta, from Siolta, one who walks, and they were known to practice the black art, which they called, metaphorically, the art of opening locks, in reference to the secrets of their trade, and Shelta, of which they alone held the key. One can imagine the black color derived from their trade name, black tinkers, Siar Danan, but it is just as probable that it referred to their appearance. According to David MacRitchie, their Irish ancestors were black, and Sir Walter Scott noted that many Highlanders could easily pass for gypsies because of their dark skin and hair. But by the end of the 16th century, the black art came to be synonymous with a special technique of housebreaking in people's imagination and Elizabethan literature. The magic of the devil. Very much in the same manner, the Mason's word was associated with second sight. Trebs in Gaelic, the ability to see the invisible, or the future, clairvoyance, the supernatural gift of the seer, sayer, which David Stevenson says was sometimes equated with witchcraft, but regarded as specifically Scottish and Highland rather than Lowland, while in reality these expressions were metaphors referring to the Word of God and the secret recognition signs used by Freemasons. During the period we are focusing on, between 1598 and 1700, Scotland was divided into two opposite groups based on religion and language. The Lowlands in southern Scotland were Protestant, who spoke Scots, also called Inglis, or Doric in Edinburgh, a Western Germanic language that evolved from Old Northumbrian English, and the Catholic, Gaelic-speaking Highlanders of the north, who refused to adopt English customs and official Presbyterianism. In the 17th and 18th century, Scots was the language of the Protestant ruling class, particularly in Edinburgh, while Gaelic was considered the language of the uneducated reactionary peasants, in other words, Catholics. Thus it is reasonable to think that the Protestants of the South, when speaking of Catholics, may have come to use the Gaelic word cumhang, pronounced Cowan, meaning narrow in a derogatory sense to refer to those narrow-minded, illiberal insulars who still spoke what the English called Irs, Irish, i.e. Gadlig. The fact that the word Cowan associated with Masonry appears in the first Shaw Statutes of 1598 suggests that it was well known and commonly used in this form, much like the word tinker was used during the same period. There is very little doubt that it was the anglicized form, perhaps abbreviated, of an Old Norse or Gaelic word that came to have a specific meaning in Scotland. Since the surname Cowan appears in this written form only in the first half of the 17th century, it is probable that it shares the same origin as the common noun. In fact, Cowan is just one of many anglicized forms of the Gaelic surname Colquhoun, pronounced Cohoun, which was first used in this form in the 12th century. It was the name of the island of Loch Lomond near Glasgow in Dunbartonshire, as well as the name of its first inhabitants who came from the Highlands. Today, their descendants are established mainly at Rosed and Luss on the bank of Loch Lomond. So what did Colquhoun mean? John O'Hart claims the surname Colquhoun is the anglicized form, like Callahan and Calhoun, of the Irish name Ciallachain, Ciallagan, from which derived Cowan, Cohen, and Cuan. This could have been the given name of the king of Munster, either O'Cololun or his descendant, O'Calichain, which plausible this explanation is unsatisfactory, as Scottish Gaelic contains numerous lexical peculiarities and loans, particularly from Old Norse and English, all of which contributed to the recognition of Gaelic as a distinct full-fledged language in the 15th century. We may also consider the fact that Gaelic was influenced not only by Scots, the language used before the Norman invasion in 1066 in the lowlands in the Northumbrian region, northern England, but also by Old Norse when the Danish invaded Scotland in the 9th century, as explained by sociolinguist Jacques Leclerc. According to historian William Anderson, the island of Colquhoun was so named by the Normans who escorted David I while he was still Prince of the Cumbrians, southern region of Scotland, then including Glasgow, Selkirk, and Kelso, which means between 1113 and 1124. This name, says Anderson, is derived from French col, meaning hill, or rather a mountain pass, and the word cohun, coin, or cuhoin, an angular corner, which would fit the description of the area, a raised ground in the shape of a corner that stretches between two mountains, at the angular corner where Loch Lomond meets the Clyde River. Anderson's explanation is not contrary to those given by other historians and philologists, including Henry Harrison, who believed the word was a local adaptation of Gaelic coil cumha, narrow woods, or cool cumhan, narrow corner. However, if Colquhoun is of Norman origin, it is more likely to be a word of Old Eastern Norse, which was spoken between 800 and about 1050 in Sweden, Normandy, England, and some parts of Scotland. In such case, coal would mean black, in reference to black wood, coal, or some black stone or iron ore, which is also the meaning of several toponyms in Normandy: Colville, Colatat, Colbosc. This would explain the origin of the Scottish Gaelic word coal, coal black, and coal burnt wood, also collier, coal maker in Scots and English, as well as the double meaning of the word coil, which means not only wood and corner, but also a black dog, like the Scottish collie, a shepherd dog with black hair. Since both Gadlig and Scots borrowed from Old Norse and English, we understand how some of the words may have slowly evolved in Scotland, like Colan, comrade, and Ciel, comrade in arms. terms that were often used in double metaphorical sense. As we shall see, the black color keeps coming back throughout history, like a memory marker. For instance, at Rose Du, from Rose Dub, black headland, Clachan Dub, black stone, the ancient name of lust, and of course the black art of the tinkers, whose origin perhaps go back to Kerry, from Ciarai, black tribe in Ireland. Whether the linguistic root of Colquhoun is Old Norse, coil, or Irish, col, we notice a common meaning. If coil refers to black wood or coal, the Scottish Gaelic roots cal, col, and seal implied something that protected, turned, or burned, often in association with fire, as in coil hill, turning wheel, or col mare, wheelwright, cal, kale, seal, to burn, also applied metaphorically in Irish to the passions, sealy, seal, sill, around, or fire tower, i.e., a place of devotion where the sacred fire always burned. Coil teach, a steeple, a firehouse, seal day, a preserver of the fires, i.e., a coldie. Calich, heat or passion of the mind. Cal, lime, i.e., burnt stone, as in calchu or calch viadnid, the ancient names of Kelso, and calcam, to burn into lime, and colag, fuel, turf, peat. Thus we are inclined to think that Colquhoun originally designated a sacred narrow corner, which was guarded by black metaphorical dogs, perhaps priests who practiced the black arts, making coal or working as blacksmiths. All this may seem as silly as the theory of Gregory Oliver, who claimed the first Cowans were the lawless, metaphorical dogs who guarded the temple of Cercion, but according to historian Patrick Tytler, Colquhoun, from which the name Cowan derived, was just the abbreviation of Colquhenorum, keepers of the dogs, supposedly from Gaelic Gilin al Con, from Gil, servant, and Con, dog, or Colleen, puppy. Tytler based his claim on an ordinance of July 1329, written in Latin, by which King Robert de Bruce approved the construction of a house for the use of the Colquhenorum in the region of Luss. But 14 years before, on March 18, 1350, the same king had confirmed the privilege of girth belt to the whole territory of Luss in a radius of 3 miles surrounding the small chapel where St. Kelso's body was buried, the warrior saint, that Bruce held responsible for his victory at Bannockburn in June 1314, thereby making Luss a sanctuary for anyone accused of a crime, waiting for a fair trial or fleeing justice. Therefore, it is possible that the Colquhenorum, the Cowans' ancestors, were refugees or keepers of dogs, real or metaphorical, who were granted the privilege to settle in the sanctuary of Luss. Besides, the coat of arms of the Colquhouns of Luss, which contains an engrailed saltire, de sable, a black X-shaped cross in heraldic terms, is supported by 2 Scottish hounds. This particular breed of Irish origin was known to be an excellent hunting dog, as well as a spiritual guardian and a fierce warrior going into battle with his master, in the image of legendary Cú Chulainn, the large hound of the Smith hero of Irish and Scottish mythology. In Ireland, the most famous hound breeders and guardians were the traveling tinkers. Now it seems the tinkers of Scotland shared the same hound breeding tradition. On January 20th, 1450, the Scottish Parliament passed a law to control a group of vagrants who were described as masterful beggars with horses, hounds, or other goods. 2 years later, James II of Scotland granted the barony of Bombay in Galloway to a certain Maclillan, who had finally caught and killed the chief of a company of Saracens or gypsies of Ireland, a man named Blackimore or Black Morrow, who lived in the woods nearby. In both cases, the said vagrant and masterful beggars could not have been Roms, since they arrived in Scotland in the early 1500s. They were certainly Sir Danan, that is to say, black tinkers from the Highlands. Were these keepers of dogs, colquhonorum, who built a house in Luss, also black tinkers, i.e. smiths who practiced the black art? Hugh Lorimer, Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, reports that King Robert de Bruce had a company of MacCowans from Clan Colquhoun that had based in the Nith Valley, Ayrshire, but according to George F. Black, the name was originally MacGowan from Mac Gobahane, son of the smith, a claim he supports by stressing the long historical link between Colquhouns of Luss, whence comes the name Cowan, an important metal working site discovered in the same area. Celtologist Alexander MacBain, who traced back the origin of the name Cowan to 14th century in Inverness, Highlands, came to the same conclusion. Quote, "So Cowan is for McGowan, Smith's son, though in the lowlands this name arose doubtless from the trade of the Cowan, the dike builder." End quote. This was also the opinion of linguist Henry Harrison, who explains the origin of the meaning of the surname Cowan. Quote, "Cowan, Celtic, a dweller in a hollow, Gaelic Cobhan or Cabhan, abbreviation of MacGowan or MacOwen, unvoiced form of Gowan." In Irish Gaelic, the consonant C, K, and G were pronounced G, while W was pronounced V. Thus the words Cowan, Coan, Coven, Gowan, and Govin were all phonetically similar, except that Gowan and Govin are local variants of Gobhan and Coban, both meaning smith. Therefore, the dweller in a hollow was a Gowan, the anglicized form of the Gaelic word Gobha, and Irish Goba, smith. Quote, "The word goba, go, is applied to a worker in iron, a smith, serd or surd, cared, to a worker in brass, gold, and silver, a brazier, goldsmith, or silversmith, sere, to a carpenter, builder, or mason, a worker in timber or stone. These are the usual applications, but as the arts and trades sometimes overlap, so the words are often applied in somewhat more extended senses." End quote. As we can see now, the Cowan of southwestern Scotland was originally a Goban from the Highlands, i.e. a versatile sewer who became a Sirdanan, the traveling black tinker of old Irish and Bardic tradition, known for his secret language, Shelta, his black art, and his obstinate refusal to comply with the rules and customs of the English enemy, including Protestantism. The first Freemason. David Stevenson confirms that at the time of the first Shaw Statutes, 1598, the Cowan was strictly forbidden to use lime mortar. This does not mean that he did not know this old technology, since Masons have used it for centuries to build walls and monastic structures such as Arbroath Abbey, 12th century, and the large tower at Abernethy, 11th century, ever since the Romans introduced it in Scotland. In addition, during the 5th century, St. Patrick had taught the Irish Celts how to make and use lime mortar, which was made by burning limestone in ovens at very high temperatures. So the question remains, why were all Cowans suddenly forbidden to use this old technique, particularly knowing that Vitruvius, 1st century BC, had already revealed the secrets of the calce, lime, in his treatise De Architectura, which during the Renaissance was considered the work of reference in architecture. In the old Irish tradition, in compliance with the Fenechas law of the freeman, the most qualified craftsman in charge of a multidisciplinary team on a building site was called an ollave, the equivalent of an architect today. The ollave was considered a seor, a wise, knowledgeable master who knew or pierced the secrets of all trades, and more often than not, the polytechnician par excellence was a gobhan sor, a ser, sor, and seer of regional variants of the same word. From the most remote times, there were in Ireland professional architects or builders, as there were smiths, poets, historians, physicians, and druids. There were two main branches of the builder's profession, stone building and wood building. An ollave builder was supposed to be master of both, and in addition to this, to be so far acquainted with many subordinate crafts as to be able to superintend them, as the law expresses it. In other words, to be a thorough judge as to whether the work was properly turned out by the several tradesmen, so as to be able to pass or reject the works deserved, all which resembles what is expected from architects and builders of the present day. The most distinguished ollave builder of a distinct was taken into the direct service of the king. In addition to this, he was permitted to exercise his art for the general public for pay, and as he had a great name and had plenty of time on hand, he usually made a large income. By far the most celebrated of all ancient architects of Ireland was the Goban Saor, who flourished in the 7th century of our era, and who therefore comes well within historic times. According to Henry O'Brien and Marcus Keene, the word Saor, came to mean free, mason, and son of God all at once. For O'Brien, who claims Saor was the same as lug, light, it was the name of the very first body of Freemasons. The first name ever given to the body was Saor, which has three significations. Firstly, free, secondly, mason, and thirdly, son of God. In no language could those several imports be united but in the original one, viz. The Irish. The Hebrews express only one branch of it by Alaben, while the English joined together the other two. During the first millennium of the Christian era, the title of Goban Saor, just like Macinsaur, son of the artificer, was usually borne by Irish monks or abbots who acted like ollaves, mastering several crafts, particularly metalworking. In the Book of Leinster, compiled about 1160, the three chief artisans of Ireland, all saints, were Tassich of Elphin, also called Assacus, St. Patrick Smith, who became the first bishop of Rahul, Conleth, a fine metalsmith and the first bishop of Kildare, and Dag, or Daga, of Innisken, the scribe and brass worker of St. Ciaran, or Ciaran, the founder of the great monastic college of Clonmacnoise. And we are not counting the dozen of Irish monks and saints who bore the title of Goban Saor. I'm not sure how to say that. It is not a coincidence that Clonmacnoise was known in the 12th century as the greatest college of architecture, sculpture, stonemasonry, and metalworking in Ireland, attracting disciples from across Europe, including Alcuin of York. This famous college had been founded by a monk whose name, Ciaran Black, was probably associated with the Polytechnician tradition of the Saor, since he bore the distinctive title of Macinsaur. The Latin chroniclers have translated the latter as son of the artificer, filii artificis, then son of the carpenter, most likely because the word carpentarius meant both chariot maker and carpenter, Saor. The epithet Saor alone was the mark of the wise, learned man from a noble and religious family, which fits the title of both Ciaran and his father, Beoit. The title and duties of this Saor, whether for a smith or mason carpenter, were passed on from father to son, in accordance with Fennicus. In St. Ciaran's case, the Irish chronicles state that his father was an artificer who made chariots, artifex curum erat, which means that he worked with wood as well as metal. In his Vita of St. Columcille, Columbra of Iona, it is written that Ciaran had an axe, an adze, and an auger, three tools typically used by the mason carpenter for working stone and wood. Consequently, we could translate Macinsaur as son of the chariot maker, primarily meaning of carpentarius, or son of the polytechnician, but not just son of the carpenter. Now, as per the tradition held in Clonmacnoise, the great towers of Ireland and Scotland, as well as many monasteries and other stone architectures, including the oratory of Galeras in Kerry, from Sir I, Black Tribe, were all built by skilled polytechnician craftsmen who bore the title of Goban Sor and who mastered up to 16 different trades. The Goban was said to know all trades, tradition of Clonmacnoise. He was Faber Aerarius, and long ago in Cork he built a brazen horse, which was the most marvelous thing in the world. The meaning of the epithet Eoldanach, master of all arts, is expressed by O'Reilly, a jack of all trades, i.e. a factotum, a dog's body in the UK, doing all kinds of work. These are the main traditions relating to the Goban Sor. A century before, Edward Lloyd had used the exact same expression, a jack of all trades, to describe the Irish tinker. This particular description of the polytechnician Goban brings to mind the biblical myth of Tubal Cain, the forger of all implements of bronze and iron, Genesis 4:22, or that of Hiram Abiff, a key symbolic figure in modern Freemasonry, described in the Bible, 2 Chronicles 2:13-15, as a craftsman who was, quote, skilled to work in gold and in silver, in brass, in iron, in stone, and in timber, in purple, in blue, and in fine linen, and in crimson, also to grave any manner of engraving, end quote. However, in an increasingly Christianized Ireland, the title of Goban Sor, born to the abbots, betrayed a pagan origin, with no biblical connection. For this reason, it was gradually replaced with the more suitable title of Son of the Carpenter, in reference to Jesus. In his article, The Round Tower of Abernethy, with drawings, architecture Richard Rolt Brash, Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, discusses the similarity of a popular tradition held by many in Ireland and Scotland, which he says could only postulate some historical foundation. It is said that the round towers in Ireland, as well as those of Abernethy and Brecon in Scotland, were built in one night by the good people, but more precisely by an architect named Goban Sor, a Freemason sage. Several of our towers are traditionally stated to have been erected by a weird personage called the Goban Sor, or Gobhan, the artificer. The name is in the mouths of the peasantry all over Ireland, as the builder not only of the round towers, but also of abbeys, castles. Dr. Petrie has tried to prove the actual existence of and age in which the Goban lived. His evidence is, however, conjectural and unsatisfactory, and at the fact of several personages named Goban being found in Irish history makes it difficult to ascertain who the legendary builder was, or when he lived. Brash and Petrie did not find any solid evidence confirming the presence of one Goban Sor in Ireland, but perhaps they would have thought differently had they seen the symbolic stone of Abernethy, early 7th century, or the Clach and Segart, the priest stones of Dunfermline, 8th century, respectively discovered in 1901 and 1856. In addition to several Christian symbols, these stones are engraved with the tools of the Goban Sor, i.e. the hammer, the anvil, and the pincers, Dunfermline, or a fork called Gobhal or Goblan, Abernethy. It is believed these two Pictish stones were erected in memory of a local saintly man, probably a Chaldean Goban Sor, which could be logical since the tradition of the Goban, who knew all trades, came from the same monastic college of Clonmacnoise as the Irish Chaldee, who founded the Abernethy and Brecon monasteries in Scotland. The Good Freemason. In Ireland until 1940, the Good Freemason was literally a free agent, dubbed Goban Sayer, pronounced Goan Seer, who worked not only in wood and stone but also in metal. He claimed to be the keeper of an old operative tradition that was passed on orally from father to son since the 3rd century AD. It was his ancestors who supposedly built the round towers of Ireland and Scotland, as well as many castles and monasteries in several countries across Europe. As a true libertus, unbound and independent, obeying only to natural law, the good Freemason was highly esteemed by the Irish peasants, who always showed him hospitality. Like his roving cousins, the bard and the tinker, both from the same tradition, he spoke a secret language whose extraordinary antiquity was established by philologist Kuno Meyer. Barlager Nasser, also Birla Lager Nasser, meaning Verlin, reverse slang, of the Freemason. Still in usage among Irish Masons during the first half of the 20th century in Munster and Ulster, this strange jargon included numerous terms of Shelta, the tinker's cryptolect, and reverse words, but more importantly, very old Irish words that had become obsolete centuries ago. According to widespread popular tradition, this secret language was created by Goben Sor, the Bard Mason, a famous craftsman whose father was a well-known goldsmith. In Scotland, a very similar language called Burla Regard, also Bialerich, is still used by the last black tinkers in the Highlands, the Orkneys and the Hebrides. But in the 1950s, as every part of the country became more industrialized, the summer walkers gradually gave up their nomadic lifestyle in wagons, along with their traditional smithing trade. According to Ross Noble, curator of the Highland Folk Museum in Kingassy and Newtonmore, 1976 to 2003, between Perth and Inverness, they were known in Gaelic as Cairdean, the iron workers or metal workers, and their original function was to go round from warring clan to warring clan, making and repairing weapons. They were the armorers of these Celtic warrior princes. Thus it is not inconceivable that their forebears were the chariot makers who built the early Cowains. In Ireland, Barlager na Saor allowed Masons to identify legitimate members of the order. When a stranger would show up and pretend to be a brother, he was asked, Un tuere det na bini, do you speak the language of the Masons? And the stranger had to answer in perfect Barlager. The same language was used to pass on the trade secrets to the apprentice, usually from father to son, following the old tradition of the Macnan Sor. One of these secrets, now lost, was the art of making a special kind of lime mortar, developed by their ancestors. They made a first mix, let it rest in a lay pit for 1 year, then they would add fresh animal blood before using it in masonry. This rather trilling ingredient was said to substantially increase the strength, plasticity, and durability of the lime mortar. Myth or fact? The exceptional property of this odd concoction is mentioned in several Arthurian stories, and it is not a legend. The same recipe was used for building houses and other structures, including the old castle called John's Court, Shanna Court, in the province of Leinster, Ireland, as well as the Round Tower of Abernethy. Their Highland cousins, the Tinkers, also had a few old trade secrets, such as the mysterious powder they used to sharpen blades, which they claimed was invented by their metalworking ancestors for the finishing of bronze swords. Could this have been the secret of the terrifying Cowain's bronze scythes? Again, this is quite possible, knowing that during the first century of the Christian era, the Celts of Britannia were metalworkers of a superior order, probably more advanced than anyone else in Europe during the same period, including the Romans. While they were never linked to the modern Freemasonry, these good Freemasons, from a much older tradition, had a similar set of 3 degrees, each one entitling the craftsman to a salary raise. The new apprentice was to obtain a first paper from a master mason, then a second one, and finally a third one called indenture. This is a contract that bound him as a young mason to the order, and which required him to complete his training with a master over a certain time. No apprentice could get his third paper for as long as he did not master Barlager Nassor, as he was strictly forbidden to teach it to anyone who was not a member of the order. The Goban Sore Mason was not only traveling craftsman in Ireland or Scotland, who used a cryptolect composed of Old Irish words. The Irish tailor spoke Berlagir na de Tilliri, the poet bard Birla na Befili, and the tinker Shelta Theri, the language of the caird smith. The later contains many words of the Irish Mason's cryptolect, which strongly suggests a close relationship with both the Irish and Scottish tinkers, if not a common origin. According to Charles Godfrey Leland, the tinker was the heir of an ancient guild of smiths, and his secret language was the legacy of the Druids and bards of Ireland. The, quote, true religion. From the moment of Protestantism officially becoming the, quote, true religion of Scotland in 1560, the entire country entered a long period of troubles, dominated by suspicion and intolerance. Anything and anyone deemed idolatrous, heretical, nonconformist, popish, Roman Catholic, or opposed to Scotland's advancement in Anglicization was denounced, reduced to silence, or burnt. Witchcraft became a civil crime in 1563, which did not stop James VI from publishing his Demonology in 1597, and while the last execution took place in 1727 at Edinburgh, the laws and decrees against witchcraft were only abolished in 1735. Deportation and execution were also the fate of hundreds of gypsies, hundreds of quote-unquote gypsies, not confused with gypsies, were quite often suspected of spreading anti-English propaganda, and for this reason many of them were put in jail or sent to the gallows. In the Highlands, clans were subjected to a massive assimilation policy. In 1609, all vagrants, beggars, and tinkers became outlaws as per the statutes of Iona, and clan chiefs were forced to send their male heirs to Protestant schools in the lowlands to learn English. Then the School Establishment Act of 1616 imposed church-supervised schools in order to civilize and evangelize the stubborn Highlanders, but more importantly, to destroy the Irish language, considered imported from Ireland and therefore doubly treacherous. Indeed, Gaelic was then viewed as the legacy of the Irish Catholic rebels rather than a legitimate language. Some clans eventually converted to Protestantism, but many others, like the MacDonalds of Glencoe, never gave up Roman Catholicism. In 1581, fearing Catholicism might return under the young James VI, the Protestants required that all members of the court, including William Shaw, endorse the Confessio Negativa that negated all papal authority. 2 years later, Shaw became the king's new master of works, which does not mean that he gave up Catholicism, but he most probably had to keep a low profile, particularly in 1584 when he traveled to France with his friend Alexander Seton in the hope of restoring the old treaties and reestablishing the old religion, Roman Catholicism, in Scotland. So it is not all that surprising, as David Stevenson explains, that the Presbyterians of Edinburgh in 1588 and 1593 suspected Shaw of being a Jesuit hostile to English interests, and one of the papists and apostates who were hiding behind the formality of the court. It is in this climate of witch hunting, growing suspicion, and intolerance that the prohibition of hiring Cowans appeared in the first Shaw statutes of 1598. In what sense was the word Cowan used at the time? It was doubtlessly synonymous with unfreeman, i.e., a peasant or serf considered socially inferior who did not possess the qualifications to work in the burgh. But this did not necessarily refer to his professional skills. In Dundee on November 7, 1576, a new law was passed to forbid the local guild members from trafficking with an unfreeman who would pretend to be a freeman, i.e., a merchant or craftsman who is not a burgess, permanent resident of the borough, nor a member of the local corporation. Quote, "No brother guild de facto for an unfreeman in selling their good under color of their own. Also that no guild brother trafficet with unfreemen under color of freemen, end quote. 5 years later, in January 1581, the Council of Dundee specifically ordered the expulsion of all tinkers who had been refused to take the Burgess oath or did not possess a ticket for freedom, a valid certificate proving they had been formally admitted as legitimate burgesses and which allowed them to work freely in the borough. Then in February 1598, the same borough passed a new regulation forbidding anyone to voice blasphemous remarks about the true religion under the penalty of banishment. Another example, which speaks for itself, is one article of the original charter of Cordner's Corporations of Edinburgh, dated 1586, and conferred by James VI in 1598, the year of Shaw's first statutes, which specifically prohibited all partnerships and conventions or covens with unfreemen. Quote, no freeman or the said craft, being burgess, pack, or peel, can be partnered with unfreemen, nor make conventions with them under the pain, often pounds, or tinsel of his freedom. Each member of at his admission makes oath that he shall be leal and true in his craft and vocation and in serving the lieges, and shall obey the deacon and masters for the time, shall defend the liberty of the craft, conform to equity and the utmost of his power, and shall keep all the general statutes and ordinances made, or to be made, for utility and welfare of the craft, without revocation therefrom, and shall not colour nor fortify any unfreemen, nor pack and peel with them, under the pain or perjury and defamation. End quote. Those rules and laws easily compare with Shaw's statutes that formally forbade the hiring of Cowans. From 1598, no master or fellow of craft shall accept any Cowan to work in his society or company, nor send any of his servants to work with Cowans, under the penalty of £20 as often as any person offends in this matter. In 1599, quote, the warden and deacon of the Second Lodge of Scotland, to wit Kilwinnig, shall obligate by oath all masters and fellows of craft within the district not to associate with Cowans nor work with them, neither to permit this to be done by their servants or apprentices. End quote. Being the king's masters of the works, William Shaw was certainly forced to apply the same restriction concerning unfreemen to corporations of masons. In other words, the Cowan was not a freeman. Then why was the peculiar word Cowan used instead of unfreeman? The reason is self-evident to us. Cowan was a much more specific term, used only in the field of masonry to designate the traveling Highland goben or tinkerer, the Catholic illiberal insular, whose tradition and language were Irish in origin, and who doggedly refused to convert, and, by the same token, had not been properly educated and trained following the English standards. To be entitled to practice his trade in the borough, the unfreeman first had to live there for at least 1 year. Sometimes a traveling craftsman could not possibly do, then take the burgess oath. Only after these requirements had been duly fulfilled could he be admitted in the local trade corporation. However, in most larger boroughs, including Edinburgh, Paisley, Perth, and Glasgow, the burgess oath included as the first obligation the complete forsaking of papistry, combined with the profession of faith to the true religion. In addition, the oath was usually taken on an English Bible. Still required in 1747, the oath began as follows, quote, here I protest before God that I confess and allow with my heart the true religion presently professed within this realm, and authorized by the laws thereof, I shall abide thereat and defend the same to my life, and renouncing the Roman religion called papistry. End quote. In 1642, the Scottish Parliament required that every man aged 18 or more take the Protestant oath, and from this moment on, he was bound to defend the true religion with patriotic zeal. In Aberdeen, a new clause was added in 1678 to the local burgess oath to specifically mention to specifically exclude from the borough all non-Protestants. But again, Scotland was bitterly divided, and in some boroughs, mainly Old Catholic fiefdoms, the Burgess Oath, which one could take to have the right to work in the borough, made no reference at all to the true religion. For instance, in Stirling, which is less than 37 miles from Luss at Loch Lomond, and literally on the doorstep of the Highlands, the Burgess Oath, as taken up until 1740s, mentions only the Word of God, and strictly in reference to matters purely civil. Quote, I swear to be a faithful burgess to the borough of Stirling, to obey the magistrates thereof, and town officers having their lawful commands, in matters purely civil, so far as agreeable to the word of God. End quote. We may now understand why and how the Mason word could have been associated in the 17th century with the word of God, i.e. the Bible, as in most boroughs the oath was taken in English. This also leaves us to ponder whether the religion in which all men agree, presented as the first obligation of English Freemasonry in the Constitutions, 1723 of James Anderson, a Scottish Presbyterian minister ordained in 1707, the very year the union of Scotland and England was ratified, was not in fact the true religion that bound both countries, implying perhaps that this stupid atheist or irreligious libertine was Catholic. Let us go back to the years preceding the Shaw Statutes and the prohibition to hire Cowans. In 1592, William St. Clair of Roslin, a staunch Catholic, was finally ordered to desecrate the family's private chapel, deemed idolatrous, by destroying every single altar. During the same period, and for several decades before, the St. Clairs were welcoming a crowd of tinkers in their private estate of Roslin during the summer. As the official story goes, this hospitality custom began in 1559 when Sir William St. Clair, 15th Baron of Roslin and then Lord Chief of Justice of the Lothians, delivered an, quote, Egyptian from the gibbets on the Burgh Moor, just south of Edinburgh. But according to historian Niven St. Clair, the close relationship between the St. Clairs of Roslin and the Tinkers began when Henry St. Clair, 1375 to 1422, brought back to Roslin a group of Tinkers from the Orkney Islands. More Tinkers appeared in Roslin in 1470, just as William St. Clair, grandson of Henry, gave away the earldom of Orkney to Scottish Crown to focus on building the Collegiate Church of St. Matthew, Roslin Chapel. The same year, Marion and Margaret St. Clair, whose father was John St. Clair of Hermiston, the senior branch of the clan, were kidnapped by some greedy uncle who wanted to take possession of the property at Polwarth near the English border. Both women were set free thanks to a tinker chief who acted as a messenger. All these stories did not involve gypsies, Roms, but black tinkers, these summer walkers, probably Catholic, who originally came from the Highlands and Hebrides and the Orkney Islands. Thus, every year since 1559, at least, while they were taught the numerous decrees and ordinances, many tinkers were accustomed to gather in the stanks at the bottom of the hill of Roslin during the months of May and June. They were allowed residence in 2 towers of Roslin Castle, one called Robin Hood and the other called Little John. They entertained their hosts of Roslin, acting several plays such as The Green Man, a character then replacing the old King of May and Green George, to illustrate the balance between chaos and harmony in daily life. But their favorite play was Robin Hood and Little John, whom they represented not as an outlaw or a righter of wrongs, but as a simple land rover who lived in the woods as they did themselves. The Sinclairs certainly acted as their protectors because this particular play had been prohibited by a decree of the Scottish Parliament on June 20th, 1555. Quote, no one should act as Robin Hood, Little John, Abbot of Unreason, or Queen of May, end quote. A body of tinkers subsequently settled down in the area on a permanent basis, perhaps those who had been expelled from Dundee in 1581. All this came to a sudden stop in 1628, when the Privy Council ordered the gypsies to be expelled from Roslin, where they have a peaceable abode as if they were lawful subjects. Since William St. Clair was then the sheriff of Roslin, he had no choice but to enforce the applicable laws against vagrancy and to evict the tinkers from his property. By some remarkable coincidence, on May 1st, 1628, as per the registration date of a minute kept in the archives of the Lodge of Edinburgh, Mary's Chapel, the deacons masteris, freemen of the Masonets, and hammermen signed a charter by which they were recognizing the same William St. Clair of Roslin as their hereditary patron and protector. The signers were members of the lodges of Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dunfermline, St. Andrews, Stirling, and Dundee, as well as masons and carpenters from Corporation o' Squaremen of Ayr. The fact that hammermen, metalworkers, united with masons, as was the case in Selkirk, was not extraordinary, because they were then considered masons who mastered the art of geometry. And besides, their motto clearly expressed their importance in relation to other crafts. In Glasgow, by hammer in hand all arts do stand. In Edinburgh and Dundee, sigillum commune artis tudiatorum or maleatorum, the hammer is the common sign of all arts. But one may wonder whether these metal workers, who do not appear in the first St. Clair Charter of 1601, were not actually tinkers that St. Clair was trying to protect. He would have had good reason to do so, as most St. Clairs and Sinclairs of Argyll, including those from Cornwall Peninsula, from Irish Comclal, joint pledge, were distant cousins of the St. Clairs of Roslin, and more significantly, the descendants of the mechanical, operative craftsmen from the clan Mac and Sierda, those Sierdanan, or black tinkers, who anglicized their name to Sinclair and Sinclair, so as to not pass for Roms. In other words, the name Sinclair was a recently anglicized form of Mac and Sierda, son of the smith. Conclusion. In the first century of the Christian era, the word Cowan, perhaps the abbreviated form of a longer word, too difficult to transcribe for the Romans, was already associated with the warriors who occupied the whole territory of Dunbartonshire, including Loch Lomond. 14 centuries later, the ancestors of Clan Cowan, Colquhoun, were established in Luss on the western shore of Loch Lomond, as well in the Nith Valley, in Dumfries and Galloway, in both cases under the protection of King Robert de Bruce. Originally from the Highlands, these people, whom de Bruce called Colquhounorum in Latin, were in fact McGowans, more precisely MacGobahanes, sons of the Smiths, in Gaelic, a name eventually shortened to Goban and anglicized into Cowan. It is most probable that these traveling metal workers were armorers and warriors who wielded both the hammer and the axe or sword, and that they were enlisted, like many other presents, to fight the English at Bannockburn, 1314. During the entire period stretching from the Shaw Statutes, 1598, to the second version of Anderson's Constitution, 1738, the Catholic Highlanders were certainly deemed illiberal, ignorant peasants resisting advancement, as well as lawless traders who refused to submit to the law of the true religion of the English. We may now understand how the black metal workers of the North, who came to be known in the South under the anglicized names of Cowan and Tinker, and who spoke not only Gaelic, but also the secret Burla Riagaird, could have been suspected of all possible vices and evil-doing. But for the Highlander, freedom and their oral tradition were non-negotiable, vested rights from time immemorial in the spirit of the Fenacas, the old law of the freeman. When we think twice about it, we understand how easy it would have been for Masons in the 17th and 18th century to compare the Gowans to the Ephraimites, since both were considered spies and rebels, unclean, idolatrous, irreligious, and libertine, opposed to religious reforms, and recognizable by their inappropriate way of speaking. And that concludes part 2 of the Word Cowan. Thank you for listening. I hope that I got some of those words right. And that was written by Francine Bernier. I've looked up to see if there's any more writings of hers, and I haven't really found anything. But yeah, if you're out there, Francine, thank you for writing this really interesting essay. It's a lot for me to think about. All right. Thank you. Goodbye. Oop. Is that on? Okay, we're rolling. So to wrap things up, I'm going to read something that I wrote in 2018. It was a blog post titled Synchronicity and Surnames. And in this blog post, I go over some of my initial findings about the word Cowan. And it does get to where I find portion of the essay that I just read. But I had not read that full essay at the time of writing this in 2018. And there's additional information in here. Also kind of strangely related, because on the other side of my family, on my mom's side, there is the surname Stewart. And although I do not believe that there's any kind of genealogical connection to the house of Stewart, there's some weird synchronicity that occurred within my family that I'll read to you right here. All right, so to start off, there is a poem by Aleister Crowley, Lambskin, from the Book of Lies. I'm going to do my best to do an Aleister Crowley impression in my reading. Above the title is Greek, and it says Kephali Li, I think. Kephali translates to head, and then Li is a cipher of the chapter, which is chapter 38. All right, here we go. Cowan skidoo, tile, swear to heal all. This is the mystery. Life, mind is the traitor. Slay mind. Let the corpse of mind lie unburied on the edge of the great sea. Death, this is the mystery. Tile, Cowan skidoo. Commentary. This chapter will be readily intelligible by EA Freemasons, and it cannot be explained to others. EA, entered apprentice. So, that poem, Crowley, I don't think he was officially really much of a Freemason, but he was given kind of an honorary entry into it, an honorary pass, because of just how impressive he was to a lot of people with his esoterics and his grappling of esoterics. He was kind of beyond probably a lot of your average Freemason, and so they were like, hey man, if you you want to be a member. But he was never that into Freemasonry. He had his like own stuff going. But in this poem, he is using Masonic references such as Cowan, which we've already established is an outsider. Tile is reference to the tiler, who is the mason who stands outside the lodge and guards it during their meetings. So the tiler is kind of like the Masonic solution to the Cowan. And I'm not enough of a I guess cipher person to really pick apart Crowley. I know that he was putting a lot of kind of like hidden stuff in there. I still have not really. I mean, I assume when he says, "Mind is the traitor, slay mind, let the corpse of mind lay unburied in the edge of the great sea," I assume he's talking about abandoning your sense of self and as you go into the abyss. Well, yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of Aleister Crowley stuff I really don't understand what he's getting at, and part of me feels he's kind of just a bit of a trickster. He's kind of playing jokes on people a little bit. Anyways, after the poem, it begins. I had a surface exposure to Freemasonry at a young age when my older brother brought home a book from the library, which expounded upon the symbols and rites associated with the orders and their degrees. I believe this was probably Manly P. Hall type stuff. At that point, I could not read, and so absorbed only a picture book recognition. By the time I was in high school, I developed an interest in esotericism and religious philosophy, tangential matters which would eventually lead me to research what Freemasonry was beyond an exclusive men's club. As many who approached the lodge as an outsider, I harbored my suspicions, but I was not afflicted with any religiously moralistic perceptual bias, which would have me prone to viewing Freemasonry as inherently evil or satanic. My sentiment of being against Freemasonry sprang from a place of feeling against society at large, as it seemed to be plagued with calculated and false order, which favored corruption and the notion of an elite hierarchy, which served as a purveyor of and cornerstone of society, a scam on natural order, which I felt was inherently good. Needless to say, I was, and still am, rather cynical of power in terms of world stage leverage, but somehow hopelessly idealistic in terms of faith for the good to arise from the common when allowed to take a natural course. I could psychoanalyze my predilections all day, but for the sake of simply illuminating my basic mindset in approaching these matters, I tend to opt towards chaotic good, and am very aware of the need for a spectrum in disposition. Any subversive intent I have harbored towards forms of establishment has been primarily motivated to subvert what I perceived of as institutional subversion. Browsing used books with no intent often leads to fortuitous finds. To paraphrase a line from a book, whose title I do not remember, which was found in such a manner, quote, "The tiler stands outside the entrance to guard the lodge from Cowans," end quote. My birth-given surname is Cowan, and so I found it a bit intriguing to be reading the word in such a context. Up to this point, I had never heard of the word being used outside of a last name. I wondered if it was a typo, a figment of my imagination, or perhaps even some elaborate Masonic prank. I had been told that the Master Mason was endowed with second sight. Could they have read my thoughts and orchestrated this scenario in order to spook me? Many whimsical thoughts of altered perception and absurd paranoia swept through my mind before I decided to go home and look it up online. Cowan, noun. 1. Crafts, a person who makes dry stone walls. 2. Freemasonry censorious, a person who has not been initiated in the secrets of the Freemasons. Quote, "This is a purely Masonic term and signifies in its technical meaning an intruder, whence it is always coupled with the word eavesdropper. It occurs in the Shaw manuscripts, a Scotch record which bears the date of 1598, in the following passage, that no master or fellow of the craft received any Cowans to work in his society or company, nor send none of his servants to work with Cowans." In the second edition of Anderson's Constitutions, published in 1738, page 146, we find the word in use among the English Freemasons thus: "But free and accepted Masons shall not allow Cowans to work with them, nor shall they be employed by Cowans without an urgent necessity, and even in that case, they must not reach Cowans, but have a separate communication." There can be little doubt that the word, as a Masonic term, comes to us from Scotland, and it is therefore in a Scottish language that we must look for its signification. I knew that the Cowan branch of my family emigrated from Scotland, and wondered how the word would come to be used both as a surname and a pejorative trade term within the same dialect. At this point, I didn't know the origin of the surname, and so was left exploring all options in tracing etymology. Quote, "There is no word that has given Masonic scholars more trouble than this in tracing its derivation. By some, it has been considered to come from the Greek, Cowan, meaning a dog, and referred to the fact that in the early ages of the Church, when the mysteries of the new religion were communicated only to initiates under the veil of secrecy, infidels were called dogs. Other derivations are from the Old Swedish kujan, meaning a silly fellow, and the French koyan, meaning a coward, a base fellow. No matter how we get the word, it seems always to convey an idea of contempt." End quote. Further Masonic references elaborated a Cowan as, quote, "a Mason without the word." I initially inferred that the word was reference to John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and thought that this could be a barring of person for lack of faith. But then later, someone who had been initiated told me that the word was simply a passcode given after initiation into the third degree, Mahabon, which is explained as a substitute for the lost word, which then in the seventh degree is the recovered word being Jabalon, which records date is a more recent invention. Other Freemasonic sources made poetic analogy of the operative use of the term as a builder of dry stone walls to reveal that mortar, in an esoteric sense, represented the bond of brotherly love, which a Cowan was without. All of this seemed only to dance around the word and toy with its implications without actually approaching its origin. It began to seem obvious that Freemasons didn't actually know why they called a Cowan, but I became determined to see just how much of a Cowan could be. And here's a little joke. Masonic Riddles, Worshipful R. Raymond. Why did the Cowan break open the thermometer? To discover the secrets of the degrees. Though Freemasons were at a loss to trace the etymology of this word, which has become established within their lexicon of jargon for hundreds of years, Wiccans and neo-pagans of a more modern history have occasion to follow suit in the use of this pejorative. There's a generalized ignorance within these New Age communities in regards to the source of their own traditions. I use traditions in quotes, as there's hardly anything traditional about the anachronistic make-believe which constitutes Wicca and neo-paganism. The claims of Freemasonry to hail back to Solomon's Temple, or the ancient mystery schools of Egypt, are laughable, but at least established by a long history of pseudo-history. The reality of Wicca and neo-paganism is that these play pretends are merely spin-offs designed as early as the late Victorian era, and created mostly by men of aristocratic pampering. There is no lineage, no continuum of legacy. It is a cul-de-sac in the piecemeal suburban sprawl of the Occidental mind, where the middle class go to fritter away their imaginations and power of intent. This is not to imply that all practices need heritage to be of value. Of course, novelty and innovation have their place when transparent to source and reflective of epistemology, but these systems are neither novel nor innovative, certainly not transparent or reflective. But what do I know? I don't know. In researching Cowan as a derivation of Scotch Gaelic, I found sources which claimed it was from Gobhain, which translates to blacksmith. Could the Masonic use of the term have originated as a backhanded way to insult those of another professional trade? Probably not. I'd come to a halt in terms of what understanding I could glean from books and web sources. All I could gather, with any amount of certainty, was that the word is probably Scottish in origin. I decided that I would eventually travel to Scotland and attempt to uncover more at the source. In my early 20s, that seemed like a pipe dream, but slowly over the years I traveled more and more, until eventually I found myself in California. I entered the used bookstore in Eureka, California, and walked without thinking to a shelf. The temple and the lodge immediately stood out, probably because of the catchy eye and the pyramid motif on the spine. Upon opening the book, I found a receipt of paid membership dues addressed to the local Freemasonic lodge, and a playing card, the Joker riding a bee. I was planning on going to the beach afterwards to play trip sitter for some friends and figured it might be an entertaining read. Spoiler, the book is largely fictional or speculation passed off as history. It's not quite as fabricated as their other book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, but it's a load of hogwash, you could say. The basic premise of the book is that many of the Knights Templar fled to Scotland after being excommunicated from the Church of Rome. In return for their refuge, aided Robert the Bruce in defeating the English at the pivotal Battle of Bannockburn, and left their legacy in Jacobite Freemasonry. That much is popular lore in Freemasonry, in any case, and can be inferred by many of the symbols and rites of its degrees. What struck me was the central role that the House of Stuart, later changed to the French spelling for their diplomatic alliance, played in all of it. I had been told at a young age that my mother's side of the family believed to descend from Mary, Queen of Scots, through the Stuart bloodline, but never actually looked deeper into the history of the family until learning that its relevance to Freemasonry. Rumors of conspiracy had long been propagated by both Masons and anti-Masons, which suggests the Stuarts, by aid of Jesuit priests, designed many of the higher degrees of Freemasonry as a tool for indoctrination in order to regain power over the British Isles after being deported to France. So I'm not going to really read some of this next part because it's basically, I entertain the idea that the American Revolution was kind of like the second plan B after the failure of the Jacobean Revolution. And I don't think that theory is really useful to entertain, simply because the American Revolution was far too complex. The members of the founding fathers who were Freemasons, none of them were introduced to this kind of masonry except for Benjamin Franklin, and he even said in his own journals that he kind of thought it was a little frivolous and it wasn't really something he was into. So there's no historical reason to believe that there is a connection between the founding of America and this strain of Freemasonry. Although later on, about 100 years or so after, no, less than 100 years after the Revolution, the Scottish Rite was formed in the United States, which brought over a lot of this type of Freemasonry. And it's hard to really know how much of that retained any of its original intent. That's still a question that I ask myself and other people who might know. So far, I have not really gotten a satisfactory answer on it. After learning of this dubious family history, I called my mom to ask her if anyone in her family had ever mentioned anything about Freemasonry. As it turns out, her grandfather, my great-grandfather, George Mantle Stewart, was a master mason, 3rd degree or higher. I ended up finding out more recently he was a 32nd degree. I asked if he had ever told the family anything about his position in the lodge. He never talked about it, she said. but I was given one of his rings and pendants when he died, and I always thought the G stood for George. Oh, that's so cute, Mom. Funny that this had never come up in conversation, but I suppose Freemasonry isn't exactly a pertinent topic of conversation to have with your mom. What do you remember about him? I asked. I remember him being very nice, but he died when I was young, so I didn't get much time to get to know him well. I asked how he died and was told that he was run over by a train, broad daylight, near his home. He often went down the road to collect hickory nuts from a field where they grew. One day I came home from school and was told he had died on the tracks. He always warned us about crossing the tracks, to stop the vehicle and make sure no trains were coming. I don't know about you, but I often associate death by train with suicide or murder, besides cases of severe inebriation. I asked questions with this in mind, and my mom told me that it was unexplainable. She didn't know, and to her knowledge, nobody in the family had any theories. He was a successful businessman involved in the dairy, auto, and tobacco industries, who had retired and was surrounded by family. Just before the incident, he had stopped in to visit my mom's house. She said the smell of his cigar still lingered in the air when she arrived. It was hard to imagine that he would have reason to just off himself. It was a freak accident, but I suspected murder. I was curious if there was a history of the family's involvement with Freemasonry going further back. I had never delved very much into my family's history and knew very little beyond my grandparents. My mom told me his father died before he was born. He was raised by his mother, Mary, who worked as a seamstress. A widow's son, I thought, and remembered Hiram Abiff, the builder of Solomon's Temple and symbolic originator of Freemasonry. I thought of the ritual of the third degree, in which Hiram is murdered at the hands of fellow Masons after refusing to give up the word. Of course, this is all wild speculation, but I couldn't help but make the imaginative leap that his death mirrored the ritual. In 2012, I met someone whose father worked for British Airways and could get me round-trip open-ended flight to the UK for $400. I left the day before my birthday and landed on British soil the first day of my 27th year on Earth. Most of my time was spent in Edinburgh, Scotland, which was a bit of a psychedelic blur, though I did manage to meet a Tyler face-to-face while doing recon on a lodge. A pretty friendly guy, actually. A few chance encounters delivered insights which I hold as valuable, but in terms of researching my family history, which I seem to have forgotten to do once I got there, there was only one real clue. On my way to Isle of Skye, the bus I was on stopped over in Inverness for a few hours, during which I entered the library to check my email. I had to show my passport to get in the computer. "Ah, a Cowan, I see," the librarian said. "My husband is also a Cowan." I smiled and nodded. She continued, "You know it's from Colquhoun." I didn't know that, and it took me till several months later and back in California before I figured out how to spell Colquhoun close enough to search for it on the internet. Of course, there was already sources saying how the surname Cowan was an anglicized version of Colquhoun, but for some reason I had to travel to Scotland before I could type in the right search engine keywords to get the internet to spit that out. I found two primary explanations for the etymology of Colquhoun in Gaelic: that it was derived from colg, sword, and chuin, generative of cu, dog, to describe a dog of war, and that it was derived from coil, wood, and cumhan, narrow, to describe a wooded narrow. I was intrigued to find once again a dog associated with Colquhoun, as had been the case in the Freemasonic speculation of Cowan, though attributed to Greek. It all still seemed rather ambiguous, but at the least I discovered, through the added bit of information, Ethel Colquhoun, a 20th century artist who I found to be inspirational and a woman after my own heart. Perhaps the most interesting source I found was an ATS reposting, above top secret, of segments from an article titled The Word Cowan, Part 2, from a site called boaz.over blog. Unfortunately, boaz.over has been wiped of any content, and the author of the blog is difficult to track down, though I did find several incidents of people making an attempt, as she seems to have created quite a stir on the internet with that article. The brief excerpt on ATS demonstrates an attempt at tying together multiple etymological roots in a manner which distills the essence from all of them. And then it goes on to give a quote from the second part of what I had read earlier. It's really not very much information they put in. They really stripped it out. And the rest of the thread it was in was very like off topic, all over the place. They were getting into like aliens and some idea that like all of this like blacksmith stuff is like connected to like communism, and like the hammer and sickle, and that like communism is like a crypto form of like this, and I'm like, okay. Anyways, the Jewish Cowan connection is something I looked further into and found several researchers who came to that conclusion, even going so far as to present genomic evidence to support their claims that many Cowans from Scotland were of Jewish lineage. So I have looked a little bit more into this. There's so much disinformation about different families in that part of the world being this or that, largely as ways to kind of like give an air of mystique. And I don't really give too much credence to that kind of stuff. So I'm not really going to read that part anymore. I eventually tracked down which lodge my great-grandfather was likely initiated into, a Scottish Rite Red Lodge of Perfection, and sent him an email asking if they could confirm his membership. I got a message back from the lodge secretary which stated he could not find record of him, but that does not mean it is not there. I have found Freemasons tend to be very coy with information, and getting a straight answer is near impossible. A week later, I got a telephone call from my mom, who said that she had been called by her cousin, who asked her, "Is your son calling the lodge and asking about our grandfather?" Apparently, I had to be vetted. Soon after that, I received another message from the lodge secretary stating, "Yes, we found record of your great-grandfather. I have given your information to a lodge historian who may contact you about your family history." Well, I have the exact opposite communication style to the typical Freemason, and on a whim of oversharing, I wrote back the secretary, kind of telling him all of my thoughts on all of it, and I never heard from them again. So as it turns out, this was only one of the lodges he was a member of. There was another lodge, because these lodges only, I think that they're like grades 4 through, I want to say like 17 or something. And then there's another lodge, and then the final lodge that he was in was a lodge that is for 32nd and higher. So I know that he was at least a 32nd degree. And the one that was a 32nd or higher is shut down. It's a very beautiful building in Corning. If someone wants to buy it, I recommend it. It's pretty affordable for what it is, if it's still for sale. I hope, dear reader, that I have not disappointed you by bringing you this far into such an obscure topic and give no real conclusion. I also hope that I have not offended anyone with my occasionally vitriolic and judgmental sentiment. I realize that everyone is an individual, and any broad sweeping observation I may have about a group is merely a caricature I have drawn for the sake of making commentary. I admit that I really do not know what is in the heart and mind of others which drives them to identify with groups which I may sometimes see as problematic. I have no place to judge the individual and no belief in collective identity as an absolute. No hard feelings here. And then I end with a little poem. Then round and round me he did tie a noble ancient charm, all future darkness to defy and ward off the Cowan's harm. Excerpt from Masonic songs, oratorio, odes, anthems, prologues, epilogues, and toasts, adapted to the different degrees of Freemasonry. All right, and that concludes my little thing, my little piece. I've changed my perspective on quite a few things since I wrote it. But yeah, we always keep growing and learning more. I will see you in the next time I upload one of these things. All right, thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great life.